All right, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining in from. Welcome to the AIM Policy webinar. You'll notice that this is a little bit more intimate of a gathering than a traditional webinar. In our outreach for this effort, we kind of curated our audience and tried to reach folks that we felt would be most kind of interested and active related to this information that's being presented today. This is our first of this kind of webinar, and we hope that y'all have uh, a good experience, and that you'll have feedback for us on how to improve this kind of style of meeting for the future, and that this audience will continue to grow. Again, this is the AIM webinar, Arizona Infrastructure for Movement. And this meeting is being recorded for folks that were not able to attend. And we also welcome folks to refer back to the recording or share the recording if you find the information that's presented and the discussion that's had today useful. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. This is what our agenda is going to look like for today. Kind of doing just a welcome and then sharing some general background information about our organization, Pinnacle Prevention, and also some of the work that we've been doing in this space related to infrastructure for movement over the past few years. Following that, I will be handing it over to Brett Anderson from Arizona Department of Transportation to talk about the state transportation alternatives program, which is new for 2023. And we're excited to hear more about what kind of projects are going to be hopefully funded through this, and what it'll look like to work with ADOT and with other folks around the state to put together some good applications and get some good projects funded. There will also be an opportunity for Q&A, since this is a more intimate setting, like I mentioned before. Following that, we have Ben Crowther, who is joining us all the way from the East Coast. Ben is with America Walks, and he will be talking about federal programs, federal opportunities. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening coming out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so he's going to talk about some of those opportunities and talk about some stories on the ground of how communities have helped to put together some really exciting projects. And then before we close out, we're going to have a section of the agenda dedicated to state and federal legislation. All of us, I think, are involved kind of at different levels in terms of being involved with, policy. And so we wanted to spread some general awareness about both some federal legislation as well as diving deeper into some state legislation that impacts infrastructure for movement. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for partners to chime in and share about events or policy work that they have going on. But as I mentioned earlier, we will be having a conversation, taking questions throughout the presentations today. So don't feel that you need to wait until the very end to chime in. For those of y'all that I haven't had the opportunity to meet in the past, my name is Kenneth Steele. I am with Pinnacle Prevention. We are a nonprofit organization based out of Chandler, Arizona, but we do serve Arizona statewide. And our organization is dedicated to cultivating a just food system and opportunities for joyful movement. When it comes to joyful movement, that refers both to the movement of people from place to place, but also the movement of our bodies and being active. So we tend to work quite a bit in transportation spaces, focusing on transit and active transportation, walking and biking. However, movement can also encompass a lot more than just walking and biking and transportation. Also delve into parks and recreation. We've done work in the past related to policy that impacts recess access for kids that are of school age. and things like that. Now, since we have kind of a smaller group, I would love it if folks would just be willing to put their name and their organization in the chat. And then after that comes through, then we'll do a quick poll just to get a better sense of what sector folks are in the room. So please take a moment and just introduce yourself in the chat. Thank you. Wonderful. As those introductions continue to come through in the chat, I'm just going to administer a quick poll. And I'll give folks about 30 seconds to answer that question. Hopefully folks are seeing that. So right now, it looks like we have the greatest representation from nonprofit, private organization, state government. And if anyone does choose other and is willing to share in the chat what you represent, feel free to do so. All right, last 10 seconds here if anyone hasn't filled out the poll yet. Okay, so hopefully folks can see that. We have folks representing all of the choices here, including community member, local and state government, nonprofit, private, and other. Ah, yes, academia. Good to see you, Allison. All right. Thank you very much for introducing yourselves, and thank you for filling out the quick poll. Before I pass it over to Brett to talk more about transportation alternatives, I just wanted to give a brief history of Pinnacle Prevention's partnership with a number of different organizations in this work of helping to improve opportunities, create more opportunities for joyful movement. So when it comes to this AIM policy meeting, the goal is to inform and inspire action regarding state and federal policies and programs that impact transit, active transportation, trails, and parks in Arizona. We know that there are probably also some local issues that folks are working on. We welcome folks to share that as well. So we're not just limited to federal and state, although that's our focus for today. Pinnacle Prevention has been working with a number of local and organizations from elsewhere on infrastructure for movement since 2020. So in 2020, we were awarded a systems change grant from the Vitalis Health Foundation. And part of that grant has been to work in partnership with the organizations on the screen: Living Streets Alliance out of Tucson, Arizona Alliance for Livable Communities, statewide organization that works at the intersection of planning and public health, the Arizona Partnership for Healthy Communities, which is a convener of folks working on place-based healthy communities initiatives, which is actually now being managed by LISC Phoenix, Local Initiative Support Corporation. And then also Health by Design all the way in Indiana. So I see Kim here today from Health by Design, and they've done a lot of great work in their state and have been really helpful to us as we approach this work over the past few years. This advisory team has worked on building our capacity within our state to do systems change and policy change that helps to create more opportunities for folks to be active, to be safe out on our streets, to have access to recreation opportunities and things like that. In 2021, we put out this call to action, active living in Arizona's rural communities. So we have a particular focus in this grant in supporting our rural communities throughout the state. Vitalis also helped to fund this assessment, which actually took place in 2019, 2020. And we did a series of key informant interviews, surveys. We did analysis of county health improvement plans to identify what are the assets and also what are the challenges that exist in Arizona's rural communities. And what we found is that while there are strengths that our rural communities have, including really active community members that are really invested in their communities, as well as the love for the natural, beautiful landscape that allows for folks to get out and be active, there's also a lot of challenges. And that call to action could be summarized in 3 main points: that there's a need for more funding for infrastructure, that there's a need for stronger policies that support the development of this kind of infrastructure at all levels, and also that there's a need for more expanded collaboration. So us being here today, I think we're addressing all 3 of these points. So again, we're really thankful that you're here. And here's a quote from the one of the key informant interviews that was done back at this time. It's all dependent on funding and resources. Many people want a sidewalk, but how do you pay for it? It's expensive and continues to increase as the economy comes back, with labor and materials that continue to increase as time goes on. So I will share a link in the chat to where you can download this report if you are interested in reading it. Again, it's a couple years old, but I think a lot of the things that were shared are still relevant to our conversation today and our work across the state today. Beyond kind of that assessment activity and engaging communities throughout the state to develop that assessment, we've also been providing some technical assistance and capacity building for some specific communities throughout the state. So we're excited to see a representative from Bisbee Bikeways here today. That's doing some work in the Bisbee area to not only improve the planning of multimodal options, but also is working on a very important project, a shared use path along State Route 80, and getting the resources needed to complete the feasibility study of that, the design of that, and hopefully the construction of that down the line here in the next few years. We've also been working with kind of the Globe and Miami community in Gila County, and they've worked on a number of different initiatives engaging with residents, with visitors, to develop a more urban active living and walking infrastructure, which includes, you can see in the picture, the Starizona Trail, which is fantastic. It's a walking tour of the historic mining staircases throughout Globe, where many of those staircases have now become murals, and it encourages folks to walk around town due to the fact that some of the park space has either been impacted by mining operations, wildfires, flooding, or all of the above in recent years. We've also been engaging with our State Department of Transportation on the state long-range transportation plan, and also the Transportation Alternatives Program, ensuring that this program gets input from nonprofit communities and other advocates. And then, of course, we've been trying to link a lot of the opportunities at the federal level from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act down to our state here in Arizona. We've been engaging with our state health department on their Arizona Health Improvement Plan. They have a health equity priority within their plan, which includes a strategy for smart growth development. And we were awarded a grant where we have an opportunity in the next couple of years to do more kind of broader based webinars touching on topics that impact communities and allow for them to have more smart growth approaches to transportation, to housing, to economic development, to community revitalization. And then of course, we continue our systems and policy change work at various levels, which are all things that we're going to talk about today. So thank you all for listening in on some of the background. And at this point, I could pause to see if any questions came in through the chat as Brett is getting his slides pulled up to talk more about ADOT's Transportation Alternatives Program.
Ryan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, Ryan, I see your question. What level did this come from?
Yeah, more importantly though, is I was interested in what you were saying on the last slide. You were talking about there's some grants related to smart growth. I'm just thinking of like the trajectory of smart growth on the larger scale and its success and uptake in with state governments. I know, like, believe it, like maybe Maryland was like the only smart growth state where it really caught on, and I was just wondering if you or Ben were aware of like what interest there is in Hobbs' office for being more of like a, I don't know if like I guess maybe official capacity of like a smart growth state, whether that would have to pass legislature or whether that would be something that the governor would take on.
That's a great question. In terms of the smart growth funding that I referenced, that came through the state health department and a pot of funding they had to implement the state health improvement plan. And so we were able to receive some funding to do a series of like webinars and workshops and an Arizona guidebook for smart growth, which is just getting started. And we're interviewing kind of key stakeholders to determine the direction of that project and, you know, what topics need to be addressed and what should be included in that guidebook. But I don't know that the state has any additional funding for that, but I think that there should be kind of continued administrative advocacy and conversations about how Arizona could be across the board, not just in the health department, supportive of promoting, implementing smart growth. Great question. All right, with that, I will pass it over to Brett Anderson. Thank you for joining us today from ADOT to talk more about transportation alternatives. You know, this is a program that has been around all the way since the MAP 21 days and then the FAST Act days. But now with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's some changes to the program. And so ADOT is making some changes here in our state as well.
Cool. Thank you, Kenneth. Appreciate that. Thank you for letting me take the time today. Can everybody see my screen okay? See, it's very good. So I just have a few slides to go through and talk about where we are with the program. Again, this is Brett Anderson, ADOT LPA and Project Resource Office. I'm the section manager. Right now, I have several hats that I've got going on, as my old position in the multimodal planning division was just advertised a while back, and I took on the project manager for the TA program. So that's why I'm still hooked with doing this. So I'm happy to be able to present to you guys today. And again, if there's any questions that come along, go ahead and fire off the questions. I'll do my best that I can to answer them. We are in the midst of, we're wrapping up some stuff here. I have some schedules and we'll go through that and give you some overview of where we're at. So today for the presentation, what we should be able to do is the understand of the TA program, where we are in the development of this program right now, where we're going, and then what are the next steps moving forward, and moving forward with, as most of the folks on here are nonprofits. So that is a big challenge for us. We've never worked with nonprofits before, so we're looking to figure out how that works and what that looks like in our world. So TA program is it's a set aside under the Surface Transportation Block Grant. as Kenneth was talking about, MAP 21, all those prior transportation bills. The ADOT used to have what was called the TERC, or Transportation Enhancement Review Committee. And we gave some money to the local COGs and MPOs to do these, to do trails, there's some bus shelters. This program, just about any project is eligible under this program. If it meets the requirements for an ST-BGP funding, it's going to meet the minimum requirements for that. Then, like on the slide, it says the single largest source of funds for active transportation projects, including trails. So this is a very large pot of money, and that is focused specifically for trails and transportation alternatives. So we have the TA funds are distributed to the local projects through a competitive grant program. They do have to be competitive. That's one of the big things that we're focusing on and for this round. It's not just a sub-allocation. There does have to be a competitive program, and that is what our consultant that we have hired on, High Street Consulting, they are working in putting all of those steps together to make sure that we are complying with all of the CFRs and the IIJA rules that come along with being a competitive program. So what projects are eligible under TA? So on and off road, pedestrian bicycle facilities, trails for non-motorized use, infrastructure related projects, systems that will provide safe routes for non-drivers, construction of turnouts, overlooks, viewing areas, a lot of the things that I think in the rural areas of Arizona, those turnouts and those overlooks are valuable to see. See our great our state parks and those kinds of things that are out there for us. So community improvement activities, stormwater habitat connectivities, and then a couple of the new things that they've added. Rec trails, safe routes to school. That's a non-infrastructure and infrastructure. So helmets, bikes, crayons, coloring activities, maps. Again, I can't think, it's probably easier to name things that aren't eligible than are eligible looking at this list. So who can apply? The tribal governments, local governments, regional transportation authorities, transit. I did a presentation a couple of weeks ago to the ASTA folks, and that was a big, they were excited to being able to be able to know about the program and be able to get bus shelters and the pullouts and those kinds of things. Natural resources, public lands, other state agencies, school districts, local education agencies, metropolitan planning organizations, so the small areas, so FMPO, pretty much all of the COGs and MPOs in Arizona, with the exception of MAG, Maricopa Association of Government, and PAG, Pima Association of Government, because they're over 200,000 in population, or we call them TMAs, Transportation Management Areas. And then one of the big ones there as well too is the nonprofits entities. They have removed those restrictions from in the past, so that's a nuance for us. We're going to have to figure out and to wade through that and figure out what that looks like and how those can benefit, how we can benefit and work together and partner with together to get projects out the door and get those things going. One of the other things that's kind of rough on our end of the deal is that the state DOT cannot be an eligible applicant. We have to, unless somebody asks us to participate. I know in the past, I've been here since 2006. And so the old TURC program, there were some things that if the local was not able to deliver the project, ADOT could step in and help deliver that project. Well, now this is going to be solely on the local, and ADOT cannot participate unless they're asked to participate and be involved with the project. Any other local or regional government entity with responsibility for oversight, transportation, or rec trails and state determines to be eligible. So again, it's a very open, and a lot of folks can participate for these projects. So as we've developed or in the developing of the TA program and bringing this back into play, our consultant has reached out to all of the COGs and MPOs, and Arizona has, I believe it's 12 COGs and MPOs. that we go with, and also work with bike pedestrian coordinators, our state parks, and our our tribes. We're working with our tribes to make sure as they are eligible applicants. So we're making sure that we're reaching out to them to get some input and some insight as to a lot of acronyms can be a barrier to reaching nonprofit works. Yes, I do find myself speaking in acronyms, and when you can speak a full sentence, COGS, MPOs, TMAs, yeah. So MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations, those are communities or urbanized areas that are over 50,000 and deemed by the census typically drives it, and then the governor has to make that designation for an MPO. COGS are councils of government. Those are regions where transportation funding kind of comes into play. And we work with those COGS and MPOs. And again, you can see the acronyms there. Sorry, I just jump into transportation mode and I just get going with the COGS and MPOs, and I apologize for bringing that. So thank you for pointing that out in the chat. State parks, Native nations, again, working with our tribes to make sure that they are included in this process as well, because they are eligible applicants for these projects. Again, our consultants doing a very good job with that. They've had several oversight committee meetings and several reach outs to get a better understanding of how we can, I think, learn from the past and what we've gone on. So here's kind of a status of where we are right now and getting some documentation put together. We're developing the approach, kind of putting a management plan together, and then a program guidance. And there's going to be some communication back and forth between all those capacities there to be able to help guide us and to be able, I think we're focusing this time really on the delivery of these projects. One of the biggest challenges from the last program in the Transportation Enhancement Review or the old Turk program was that we get things started and then they would sit for months. And on an FHWA, Federal Highway Administration, who are the keepers, if you will, of the funding, they don't like things when things sit for too long. They go on an inactive list, and then the DOT gets a check mark against them, if you want to look at it that way. I mean, it's kind of frowned upon. So we want to, once we get these projects going and started, we want to make sure that we can deliver these projects and get them ready to go. So we're developing an approach. We're going to come up with a management plan, and then there's going to be some guidance on how all this comes together. And we can talk about that in the next couple slides that I've got. So again, a couple of things that we want to talk about here is, take the good from the last TA program, what went well, how things went, maximize those opportunities and avoid the bad things that happen. And then I think one of the bad things that I talked about was those inactive projects. We want to keep it simple as much as possible. Again, federal funding, there is a lot of hoops to jump through, and there's a lot of oversight and monitoring that goes on. So we want to keep it as simple as possible, but maintaining some flexibility as well. We're focusing on a very strong screening process in the beginning to help keep the applicants, make sure that they can stay focused and help a good scope and get things started off on the right foot. Take a little bit of extra time in the beginning, may have big dividends in the end and the payoff down the road. So we're focusing on, again, making sure that those projects are deliverable and that we can get them started off on the right foot and not have to go retract anything or go backwards. Keep the application straightforward, project evaluation, quantitative assessment, and then as support by some additional qualitative considerations. And then and then moving forward is kind of learn from the existing process and be able to maximize opportunities that are involved with that. So here we are with the next steps. So ADOT's, we're set to complete the TA setup and the criteria coming along with the consultants. That's happening at the end of April. Our oversight committee that we've established to help pull things together, which involve the COGS and MPOs that we talked about, those councils of governments and metropolitan planning organizations. All of those folks are part of our oversight committee. Now, as we go forward and develop our what they're calling a TAC, our TAC Technical Advisory Committee meeting, we may be reaching out to those COGs and MPOs, and they may reach out to those around them to help get a strong TAC, to get to have that involvement to be there. So we're going to be reviewing the application process and how things are coming apart or coming together there, and that will be in the May timeframe. We're going to work with the COGs and MPOs to help get a good application process. That's going to be end of May, first part of June. We'll probably do a call for projects and do some webinars to help locals and nonprofits and all that are applying, some webinars on what that might look like and how to go about that. And that may be that roll into anticipated call for projects in July, which then would be the funding for the FY24 is where that's going to end up rolling into. So that is about where we're at with things, with the schedule and the timing of things. I know that was really, really quick, and I do apologize for the acronyms. And I, if there was something there that didn't quite resonate with anybody, or you didn't know what an acronym was, I definitely can help out with that. And again, I'll stand here for any questions.
Thank you so much, Brett, for being here. Let's see if folks, if there are any questions about transportation alternatives, this is your chance.
I have a quick question again.
Yeah, Ryan.
So the PIMA, the PIMA Association of Governments, they also have like the RTA. So while PAG wouldn't qualify, does that mean our RTA would or would not qualify?
I believe that the way that we're building the program now is because there's opportunities for PIMA Association of Government or for PIMA County to apply through PAG, that would be the avenue that you would go through, because there is funding, TA funds that get submitted to PAG, PIMA Association of Government, and to MAG. So those large TMAs, they get set aside funding from this program already for a TA program. And I believe some of them are pretty successful. I know MAG does a great job. I'm not sure how well PAG is doing, but they do get a set aside, and they have been able to get. I know Safe Routes to School has been an ongoing program in the Maricopa County region, and that is something that's been successful. So something very similar, but yeah, unfortunately they won't be eligible for this program because you do get funding through your TMA. Great question, though. Thanks, Ryan.
Brett, so since this is the first time in a number of years that this program is made available to Greater Arizona, these areas outside of the MAG and PAG EMA regions, one thing that we hope is that folks can help spread the word and get this on people's radar. How would you recommend folks kind of helping to spread the word to local governments, and then what are some initial steps that local governments can take to get prepared for the launch in July?
So yeah, no, one thing that's a great question, Kenneth. And one of the things that I would point out here, and this is keep a watch on ADOT's webpage. We have a new director, Jennifer Toth, and we are in the process. At the end of this month, we will be launching a new webpage, an ADOT webpage, and along with that new launch, when this TA program becomes ready to roll, we will have a web page for the TA. So that would be the place that I would recommend, being able to see that and be able to pull that together.
Great. And should cities and towns be already having conversations with their COGs and MPOs? Because we've heard that they'll need to have approval or show some sort of partnership with their COGs and MPOs.
Again, yeah, that's a great question, Kenneth. I think right now we're focusing on, getting, as as a nonprofit or any other entity applying for the TA program, we would require that you go through our COGS and MPOs and make sure that the projects are in a tip. So that's that. Yes, I would recommend reaching out to your respective COG or MPO and let them be aware that, hey, I have a possible project, or I have something that I would like to think about, and get it on the radar screen for them, because so they can be aware of what's coming, so that when time does come and we have those webinars and working with our COGS and MPOs, they can be aware and pass that information back as well. So yeah, that's where I would recommend that.
Thanks, Brett. Ryan, another question?
Yeah, Ken, where are you operating right now with Pinnacle? You're in the rural areas, right? I'm curious what you're doing. Maybe that's a later update.
We're all over the state. So our rural systems change grant is coming to a close from Vitalist, but so we had some special attention focused to rural communities, but we are working with communities all over the state.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just did like a 70-mile bike trip in Tombstone this past weekend. I'm really beat up from it, but I'm just thinking about what Tombstone might want and just other small places like Bisbee and whatnot.
Yeah, totally. Patricia, I saw your hand come up.
Yeah, thank you. And apologies if this question is redundant or other people know the answer, but I'm sort of new to this whole scene. So can you explain a little bit about what exactly a nonprofit entity would need to obtain from RTA, our MPO, PAG in Tucson here in order to apply? Like, just kind of lay out the steps and exactly what is needed to get that approval.
Sure. So right now, the way it stands is that you would be, there would be, we do the call for projects. There's an application process, and then as those application processes come in, and they typically run through the COG and MPO. And so what they want to do is make sure that, just in case there's not two people applying for the same thing. And so we wanted to have it vet through those groups. They would have regional plans going on. They have long range plans, short range plans. And if it's something that's not in conflict with something that's already going on, or if it's something that they want to add to an existing project that they have, that's part of their TIP, that as these are federal funds, they are required to be in part of a TIP, transportation improvement plan. So that's the main gist of why we work with the COGS and MPOs, because it has to be in a TIP. The project, whatever the project that's awarded, will have to be in the TIP.
I'd like to follow up on that, Brett. So with my department at the county, we're the administrators of our community development block grant, and we use a grant application tool called Zoom Grants. And we have two phases where we have basically like an introductory phase for people to share stuff about their organization, and then there's a more technically involved one where they have to do a lot more reporting. And I'm just thinking about what the infrastructure is, following on Pat's question. Like, do you guys have navigators, or what's the process?
For putting that, right now, it's just a screening process that we're going through to see if the project is eligible, if it's what the functional class is, where to make sure that it fits the criteria, the minimum criteria for being a TA project. Again, it's federal funds, so it has to be on a rural minor collector or above in order to qualify. And so those are some things that need to be vetted through the process. And then we are doing it through an ESRI environment, so that we can validate some of those projects and be able to pull things in. There'll be a map. We'll be able to put things in and geocode things and be able to see things and be able to kind of do what they call a clash detection to see if there's overlap on some other stuff, other projects, or if entities are putting in for the same, again, same projects. We want to make sure that we're not, giving funding to multiple organizations that are talking about the same project.
Right, and it sounds like the technical lift is mostly on your side, though?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yep.
Thank you, everyone, for the question. And just in the interest of time, so we can move on to Ben's presentation. I know Brett had his contact information on the previous slide, so maybe you could put your email in there if anyone has any in the chat, if anyone has follow-up questions. And yeah, I think everyone spread the word for when we get closer to the launch of the new TA program. And we're hoping that, you know, it's a good learning experience for ADOT in the first year, and that we'll see how things go for future years, as well as this continues to see increased funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in future years, especially, you know, what technical assistance will look like, and what it'll look like to help support communities that are smaller or nonprofit organizations to be able to apply for this and be successful.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kenneth.
Brett. All right. So yeah, let's pass it off now to Ben from America Walks. We're so glad that you're here, and look forward to what you have to share. We're kind of zooming back out to the federal level, but I think that Ben's information is going to be really, really exciting to hear about.
Thanks, Kenneth. It's great to be here. Great to meet all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit. And what I wanted to cover today quickly was some federal opportunities that exist, including the Transportation Alternatives Program, but also thinking that about I think a little more than half the people on this call aren't working for local governments or state governments, right? What's your sort of role in this ecosystem for getting federal funding for walking and biking to your community where it's needed? So America Walks, I'm our advocacy manager. We're a national nonprofit operating, I guess, technically out of Annandale, Virginia, but that's our PO box. We're an entirely virtual organization now. And we've been around since 1996. If you're not familiar, what we do, we support local advocates who are champions for walkable, accessible, and equitable places in their community. And we provide voice at the national level for walkability. So really lifting up the different messages that we hear and talking to people like you, and trying to shepherd them into things like the bipartisan infrastructure law. So I just want to take one quick moment to talk a little bit about a subset of our work that's called the Intersections Initiative. And this is a collaborative effort between America Walks, the League of American Bicyclists, and the Safe Routes Partnership. And the idea behind the initiative, and the reason why I'm here today, is to make advocates on the ground, including those in government, aware of the different federal opportunities that exist for funding walking and biking infrastructure. It's a program, this initiative is a program that's funded by CDC's Active People, Healthy Nation, that program there. And the idea behind it is really, recognizing that there's a lot of demand out there for these types of projects. Yeah, we still are seeing, in terms of the federal programs, some of them are actually undersubscribed. So we're trying to connect those dots, right, and make sure that everyone's aware of what opportunities are out there. And once again, helping communities on the ground to access them. So I'm going to cover today a few different federal transportation programs. I'll say this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. I'll drop in the chat afterwards a spreadsheet that is an exhaustive list. It is an overwhelming spreadsheet, but it just illustrates how much money is out there for walking and biking infrastructure. But today I'm going to cover just briefly transportation alternatives, adding a little bit of context to what Brent said. I'll cover Safe Streets and Roads for All, which is a competitive grant that's administered directly by the US Department of Transportation. And I'll touch briefly on Reconnecting Communities, a program that's intended to bridge barriers, bridge infrastructure barriers, transportation barriers like highways that divide communities from each other. Then I want to talk too about, as I said earlier, what's the role of local advocacy in this ecosystem, and particularly in identifying different projects that are out there and building support for them. So I think that that sidewalk on the left is not an unfamiliar sight in many places in America, right? If the sidewalk even exists at all, in poor condition, not maintained, inaccessible, to anyone who needs to use a wheelchair or something similar. And this on the right you see here is that same stretch of sidewalk after funding arrived from a Transportation's Alternative program. This is in Durango, Colorado. So this gives you, a sense of what this type of program now coming online with the competition in Arizona is intended to fund and has funded elsewhere. Really those, basic fundamental building blocks of being able to get around your neighborhood, your community, by walking, by biking, by rolling. And so as Brett said, this is the #1 source, transportation alternatives for bicycling, walking, and safe routes to schools funding. Brett had a great list of types of projects that it covers, a lot of overlap here. I'm just highlighting sidewalks, crosswalks, bike lanes, trails. And the goal here is really to support local priorities. This is a competition that's awarded by state DOTs and MPOs, and can cover, give or take, usually around 80% of the project's cost with that share. There's been some new flexibility that's come out of the bipartisan infrastructure law that makes that little squiggle in front of our 80% happen, which we can talk about a little bit later too. I have this slide in here. I think Brett covered this well as well. But really that question, getting it down to the bottom, who can apply, in the bipartisan infrastructure law in particular, nonprofits are a new eligible applicant here. And so I think, to think a little bit about the bigger context, why are you applying to this program, or why are you telling your local powers to be, your local agencies, why they should apply? And if you're trying to make that case, we have a few different points that you can raise to make the argument. And first and foremost is that this funding is specifically to support walking and biking. So you're not out there competing with any road widening project, any sort of automobile infrastructure project. This is dedicated funding for walking and biking, and so that limits that pool and limits the use for these funds, but in a good way here. Also by law, and this is in particular important for some of the smaller communities out there that don't necessarily have, are worried about staff capacity, right? Putting together these applications. So our second big bullet point here is by law, almost 60% of the funding that's available through transportation alternatives gets divided into different competitions that are based on community size. And that's really important, right? That's leveling that playing field. That means your application is competing against peer applications and not necessarily the applications of a larger city that has a well-equipped planning department that can just go out and pump out, a number of grants each year. And the last point that we really like to emphasize is that historically, we've seen half of all TAP applications get funded nationwide. And that's a for a competitive grant program, that is a really high percentage. And so once again, if the city staff, planning staff that you're talking to is perhaps apprehensive about dedicating time, this is not a slam dunk in terms of an application, but a very high success rate. And I think we're gonna see that actually increase as time goes on, because each year the bipartisan infrastructure law is increasing TAP funding, so that by 2026 it's going to be at 70% over the pre-infrastructure law levels. So if we're expecting, historically that's been 50% of success rate, and there's even more money in the pot, that speaks well to future developments. So the second program I want to cover is the US Department of Transportation discretionary program, Safe Streets and Roads for All. And I show this map here because this is what happened out of the first round of funding that was just recently released with Safe Streets and Roads for All. And you'll see on the map a pretty wide distribution of grants that went out, and at the end of this round, half of all Americans in terms of population will actually have a safety plan for their streets and roads through this first round of funding. So this has been a really comprehensive program in starting to take those initial steps, both for planning walking and biking infrastructure that's safe, but also there's implementation grants too, to actually put the hard infrastructure in place. So this program, as you might imagine from its title, Safe Streets and Roads for All, its stated goal is to reduce and eliminate roadway deaths and serious injuries, both through planning and infrastructure. And there's 3 different types of grants here. I'll cover them a little bit more in detail in a second. But that's the action plan grant. Then there's the supplemental planning grant. And then finally, there's the implementation planning grant. And this program will run through all 5 years of the infrastructure bill at $1 billion each year. 40% of that money has to be allocated for planning. And we can talk about how that can be leveraged in a little bit. But the opportunity right now, the second round for Safe Streets and Roads for Safe Streets and Roads for All is actually opened right now. It'll close on July 10th. So in terms of your planning, the program opens just about annually, roughly April or so, and closes roughly at the end or middle of summer for future years. So what are each of those different grant opportunities? The first one is for action plans. And this is funding basically to create a comprehensive safety plan in your community, something like a Vision Zero plan, something that has a large overarching vision, and to look a little bit as well into where are dangerous intersections, where is safe infrastructure for walking and biking lacking, doing that sort of inventory taking and developing solutions that can be adopted later on. The supplemental planning grants builds on that a little bit. Let's say you have an existing action plan, whether it's a Vision Zero plan, something like that. But you want to actually do some more in-depth planning work at one of those dangerous intersections or a place where there isn't a safe crossing. Supplemental planning grants can fund that activity. And one of the interesting things about them too is it can also fund quick build projects as well as demonstration projects. So if you're looking to make the case, for a bike lane along a particular road and try it out, a supplemental planning grant could be a very good way to go there. And then, of course, last but not least, implementation grants, turning that tactical project or turning something that's in a plan into permanent infrastructure. Also including some other things like deployment of technology with regards to safer vehicles and other programmatic implementations. So Safe Streets and Roads for All is a little bit more limited in who can apply, right? We saw on the TAP side of things, we have nonprofits, we have schools and school districts, parks agencies. Over on Safe Streets and Roads for All, it's largely the usual suspects in terms of transportation planning. So that's your MPOs, your counties, your cities, your towns, transit agencies, as well as tribal government, or a combination of any of these above. And so why apply, right? You know, thinking about this versus something like transportation alternatives. I mentioned earlier, 40% of that money is dedicated for planning purposes. You know, well, I think at the end of the day, we all want to see things built. You know, we can't downplay the planning process for identifying future fundable projects. If you're thinking about, how to get identify projects for a transportation improvement. This is one avenue to get to that route. And the projects that are identified, through an action plan don't necessarily need to be, funded continually through Safe Streets and Roads for All. Once you have that plan out there, you can shop for other sources of funding as well. So that broadens the avenues that you can take. Once again, for the smaller cities and towns out there, we saw in this first round of applications that US Dot was really prioritizing planning awards for these types of communities, getting them to get projects in the pipeline so that they have the capacity and they have the plans to go ahead and apply for something like an implementation grant in future times. And then, one of the biggest arguments here, and this is really unfortunate, but the silver lining is in this first round, $200 million went unclaimed from this program. It is an undersubscribed program. We know that there's the demand out there. So the important thing I think here, right, is making that connection and linking that demand to a program like this so that this type of money isn't left on the table, but we're spending it across the country to make our streets and roads safer places. And so those, are, I think, if you're talking to eligible applicants and trying to convince them to apply, some ways that you can start to leverage what's available through this program. So I said I'd talk really briefly about reconnecting communities. I'm not going to do a sort of deep dive into the eligible applicants and things like that, but I want to use this as sort of a framework to think about how you identify projects. And reconnecting communities, this is a program that's meant to address transportation barriers like what you see here, the Inner Loop East in Rochester, New York. This highway, and you see Great Barrier, right? It is a moat for all intents and purposes. And it doesn't exist anymore. This is same image, same perspective, Rochester, New York. This was not a program funded through Reconnected Communities. It's actually funded through a federal RAISE grant, but it is sort of the inspiration for Reconnecting Communities types projects where you are building a more appropriate city street with sidewalks and bike lanes. And Rochester's actually gone to fill in that 6.5 acres of land that they've reclaimed from the highway and build over 500 apartments on that land. So increasing housing, literally highways to housing. But this program, Reconnecting Communities, was new this year in the infrastructure law. And that presented opportunities for identifying what sort of projects would be a Reconnecting Communities project. And I want to draw attention to one example here. This is what the Metro Planning Council, a nonprofit in Chicago, did when they heard about the announcement for reconnecting communities. And maybe this can serve as a bit of inspiration for, with the new transportation alternatives program coming on online in Arizona. Something that you all are maybe already are doing something similar or could even adopt. But the Metro Planning Council, upon hearing about reconnecting communities, wanted to identify all the different possible reconnecting communities projects that existed in their region so they could bring it to the attention of their MPO. So their MPO could go out and apply for a reconnecting communities grant. And they did this in a great way. They started by combing through all of the existing plans and giving a check mark to ones that would meet the reconnecting communities criteria. So there's already a base of what exists out there. But they also turned back to their best resource, people living in neighborhoods, right, residents, and they put online and through a number of different outreach activities, gathered information from residents about what sorts of reconnecting communities projects they would like to see, whether it was in a plan or not, right? And so the residents could submit projects, tag it on the map, talk a little bit about what the problem, that this project could solve, what that was. And so through this entire process, Metro Planning Council came up with 122 projects that the Chicagoland region could submit to reconnecting communities. And they did. They did submit an application for one of those projects. So that I think speaks a little bit to the role of where advocacy organizations, community-based organizations, local nonprofits can fit into this ecosystem. So we can think just outlining sort of 4 different ways that to participate in something like a new transportation alternatives program. Going out and mobilizing support. Here at America Walks, we're a big fan of the walk audit. Getting neighborhood residents together, taking a walk that's about a mile long, having a sheet where you record things that's work well for mobility, and things that don't work well for barriers for crossing the streets, things like that, and invite your local electeds out to do the walk with you. Invite your local agency officials out too. Collecting data, I think, is another great role that can be played for advocating for these projects and working in partnership with government to promote these projects. There's a lot of pre-work that goes into making the case for specific projects when applying for grants. And so collecting some of that data about how many people are moving around on sidewalks in a corridor, or trying to cross the street, or is speeding an issue here? How many getting actually a radar gun and going and clocking? How many drivers are driving over the speed limit, driving dangerously along the corridor? Collecting that sort of data helps both make the case to your government officials, but can also be rolled right into an application, right? And that supports, in a qualitative sense, that effort. And then on the qualitative side of things too, right? Telling some of the stories, thinking about, not just, how many people are trying to cross that street, but telling the story of, why they're trying to cross the street. Is this someone who is, trying just to get to work, but has to cross a busy 4-lane road because, the bus stop that they use is on the other side of that road. But there's no, there's no safe crossing there. There's no, traffic doesn't stop, but they have to cross that street to get to work. Telling those sorts of stories and illustrating why this is a problem is really important. Once again, both for making the case to local agency officials, but one that can also be rolled into an application for a project. And then last, but certainly not least here, thinking about consensus building. We at America Walks, if we sketch these things out at sort of the highest level, we sort of see three bubbles of different groups where you need at least two of them usually to get something done. So that's the general public, elected officials, and agency officials. If you have all three, that's that slam dunk. If you have 2 out of 3, you probably get something done. And so, in a lot of cases, we see a lot of road widenings and sort of business as usual approaches happen because agency officials and elected officials are in alignment or something like that. But you all in the nonprofit world and the community-based organization world, just as community members too, you are the ones representing that general public side of things and have the best opportunity to mobilize the general public and align one of these two elements to create that 2 out of 3 threshold. So working to build that consensus there is a key role, I think, that you all play. So I'm going to pause there because there's a lot of information. I'm happy to follow up with questions. I'm sure there's some that piled up in the chat while I was speaking, but I definitely reach out to me too. Yes, check out the Intersections Initiative website. It's an opportunity if you do have questions about a particular project you're working on. We and our partners at Safe Routes Partnership and the League of American Bicyclists will do we'll do a triage call with you and talk for a bit and help you figure out what the next steps are for moving something like that forward.
Thanks, Sven. And yeah, the Intersections Initiative has already talked with a couple Arizona communities up in Navajo County and in Yuma County. So again, thanks for paying attention to Arizona communities. There's one question in the chat: was the Reconnecting Communities grant program fully allocated, or was there money left on the table? And then after that, Jim has a hand up for the next question.
Yeah, the Reconnecting Communities program was highly oversubscribed. I think they got, I forget the total number of applicants. They got far more though. I think they awarded about 50 projects or so, 5 implementation, 45-ish in planning. And yeah, there was not enough money to go around. The good news on that is that so there was this Reconnecting Communities is $1 billion over 5 years. So you can imagine that won't, in the infrastructure world, that does not go nearly as far as you'd like. But we are seeing in the, not the bipartisan infrastructure law, but the Inflation Reduction Act has what's called the Neighborhood Access and Equities Grants. And those are essentially a bit of a top off of a Reconnecting Communities program, another $3.4 billion, I think it is. And to Ryan's point in the chat here, right? I think we've seen a lot of mitigation projects over projects that are dealing with root issues for having a road that divides. There are some additional protections in the neighborhood access and equity grants for a few things like that. But there needs to be, this is another certainly on the advocate side of things, pushing your local electeds and your agency officials to have really transformative projects, right? And not just putting Band-Aids over highways or things like that. I think that's covers that maybe too much.
No worries. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I was at a community meeting that was organized by Councilwoman Laura Pastor this past week. There's about 80 people in the audience, and I bet 90% of them would be, per this group, NIMBY folks. And I'm just waiting. waiting for the comments from the audience about the development projects that the councilwoman and the panelists were talking about. But what was interesting when they started to stand up and talk about their concerns, it was a little bit about the projects, the development projects themselves, because we get we're getting a ton of these crappy 5-story weight room on the first level apartment complexes all over. And the main things people were talking about were, I wish the development was walkable. I wish the development was tree lined. I wish the development was accessible. I wish the development was a quality development. And I'm going, do planners consider this kind of input NIMBYism when it really is, WIMBYism, quality in my backyard? And so why aren't cities or municipalities really pushing for applying for these types of grants for the crappy projects that were, that are initially perceived or created or not implemented, but proposed, that's the word. So we can have better developments than the crap that we're getting. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I think that's, I think that's building that consensus there, right? Like, and harvesting that. And I do feel like, I do some advocacy here in the Boston neighborhoods for my own neighborhood, right? And you get a similar perspective, but getting people to see, to be able to see themselves in that end vision, right? So thinking about, like, we want the space to be walkable is something that's outside, I think, of some of the the larger culture wars, a relatively universally accepted a good thing. And so I think that's the to your point, right? Like being able to harvest and mobilize some of those opinions and people, so that you can tell the local planners with a coherent message, right? Like, this is what we should be looking for.
Can I jump in? Like, so Jim, I think, like, if I'm trying to idealize how this would work and to improve private development, that oftentimes they do have the offsite responsibilities of improving the streetscape of some magnitude. Like, I don't know if these grants necessarily, I've never read anything within the format of them that it would improve their scores if it was a public-private partnership in order to improve the private development side, and alleviate their responsibilities to improving the block pattern or the streets that they're installing, and maybe dedicating to the public right of way improvements or offsite improvements or anything like that. So I'm not necessarily sure that the IIJA discretionary funds are necessarily aligned to do what you're asking, but I think that is the challenge of the transportation side of planning and the development side of planning, the zoning and development. We talk about those things being related and attached at the hip, but there's so few examples. Brian Stevenson puts into the chat cul-de-sac, which is a good example. Like, they're actually being mindful of how the buildings are oriented and pocketed so that the site is still permeable for people to walk through, right? And so many of our developments that we see in the downtown arena, are the super blocks that throw up a big building that don't recognize the block patterns that make for the whole neighborhood to be more walkable and connected to transit or walkable corridors. So I think that in order for our zoning standards to sort of really promote the walkable street pattern, and then the city to come back with a grant that improves what walkable streetscapes ultimately feel like and look like, and provide the comfort that pedestrians are looking for. Those things have to sort of find a way to coexist in a way that I think is not really very well coordinated right now.
Not very well.
But I mean, we do have a woo code, you know, so I want to say that there has been some attempts at trying to do the walk-up code and all that in downtown Phoenix. I just don't know if people are pushing them in a way that's really getting the most out of what those ideals of the code would offer.
A lot of these people go to, degrees in urban planning, but yet they never do it. They never.
Yeah. I mean, we had some really rock star consultants that did the walk-up code and everything, right? So like, there's some
totally, but
we had some good content in there, yeah. But it's whether or not
ideas, plans,
carried out.
The implementation, and we're not getting it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate the comments and the question, and I think it's a good ongoing conversation for us to have. Thank you again, Ben, for talking both about these federal opportunities, but also on the ground, how communities can mobilize and come up with great projects. Really appreciate it. And Ben threw some more links in the chat. I want to move us into some legislation. The first piece here might partially address Carolyn's comment about community members having to write grants in communities. So I want to share about the Arizona Smart Fund. So this was passed in the 2022 Arizona State Legislative Session and allocated $50 million for communities across the state to support their grant writing and their applications and their readiness for implementation of projects across the state, especially with regard to these federal discretionary opportunities that Ben just outlined. So it's the State Map Advantage for Rural Transportation Fund. And so recognizing all of these new federal opportunities through the bipartisan infrastructure law, legislators in Arizona set aside, approved this funding. And since this, many of these programs are very highly competitive, and they knew that we need to have well-developed applications in order to be competitive, these dollars go out to local communities to help them with what's called grant development and submission. It also helps supply dollars for local match, which can also be a barrier to some of these smaller communities for applying. And if you have to put up 20% local match on an infrastructure project, that can be a big, sizable amount of dollars. And then also these dollars can be used for design and engineering services reimbursement for like a future grant submission that you're looking at doing next year. Out of this $50 million, 20% goes to counties with populations of 100K or more. 20% goes to counties with fewer than 100,000. 20% goes to cities and towns with a population of $10,000 or more. 20% goes to cities and towns with a population of fewer than 10,000 persons. So it probably would apply to Bisbee. And 20% goes to ADOT. I will put the link in the chat to the Smart Fund, and there's all the FAQs, there's all the eligibility criteria. There's also a link to all of the federal discretionary grant programs as well there. So I think ADOT did a good job putting together this website. I myself, I don't know how much outreach they've done about this really fantastic opportunity, but I thought I'd take advantage of this opportunity today to share a little bit more about this. And then it looks like in the chat, some other folks are offering other resources for you as well. So something to look into, something to share with your local government contacts as well. One piece of federal legislation I wanted to share is this HR 1668, the Sarah Debbink Langenkamp Active Transportation Act. It was sponsored by Blumenauer out of Oregon, co-sponsored by Representative Raskin out of Maryland, and then co-sponsored by about 17 others across the US. And is a bipartisan effort that helps to improve active transportation infrastructure. So Sarah Debbink Langenkamp was a US diplomat that was living in Ukraine, and during all the uprising came back and moved back to the US with her family and settled in Maryland. But she was hit by a large truck on her commute home from work. And so she fled a war zone only to die on the streets near our nation's capital, as her husband shared. And so this Transportation Act is named in her honor. And what it does is it helps unlock highway safety improvement program funding for projects that local governments identify and get funded through programs like Transportation Alternatives, and allows for the flexibility of HSIP dollars to be used for that local match component. That was written into the bipartisan infrastructure law, but the way that it's playing out is not exactly as planned. And it turns out that states are kind of looking for projects that are within some of their state plans and already prioritized there. But this allows for local governments to identify those projects, and allows for these safety projects to be fully federally funded, where those local match dollars sometimes end up being a barrier, like I mentioned. So I will share an article about the bill so you can read more about the story of its origin. And then also People for Bikes has a sign-on letter that you can send directly to your congressional representative to ask them to support this act as well. It's only been introduced and assigned to a committee, but it hasn't moved much farther than that, unfortunately. So folks, that are here today, folks that are listening to the recording after the fact, we hope that you find the letter from People for Bikes, and that you're able to send a note to your legislator. As we talked about in our Arizona Infrastructure for Movement, we're not only supporting active transportation, which has been kind of the bulk of our discussion today, but also parks and trails. And so the state Parks and Trails Heritage Fund was initially instated in 1990, and it was through a voter initiative that passed with, I believe, over 60% public support, that there would be $10 million a year that goes to the Arizona State Game and Fish Fund, and then $10 million a year that goes to the State Parks and Trails Heritage Fund. During the Great Recession, the portion that goes to parks was swept. And then only in 2019 was the program reinstated with no funding. And then in 2021, it got some funding through the legislature, and also got some federal ARPA dollars. And then in 2022, Jim and other advocates from the Heritage Alliance were able to get another one-time, I believe, $2.5 million of funding. And so now there have been two bills introduced that are moving through our state legislature, 2806 and 1224. One is a one-time general fund appropriation. The other is an ongoing $10 million restoration of the fund. And they have basically made it through their bodies of Chamber of Origin and been transferred over. House bills go to the Senate, Senate bills go to the House. They've been heard in committee, but we just need more advocates to contact their legislators to advocate for these programs to make it into our final state budget. So Jim's sharing some more information there. This again is dollars for state, regional, local parks and trails. And definitely really need these resources out there to continue to improve our parks, and also to do historic preservation efforts. So with the last couple minutes here, I'll talk about the last few bills. I call this bill here, or this page here, Plain Defense. And there have been a series of bills that, we also call the bike lash bills, bills that are impacting the ability for the state and also for cities and towns to be able to provide multimodal options, including walking options, including bicycling options. These particular bills were all introduced by Senator Hoffman out of Legislative District 15, covers East Mesa, Queen Creek, and 1697 failed. There was one vote from Senator Carroll that prevented it from moving forward, but it would have prohibited ADOT from using federal dollars to build bikeways and walkways. The issue was just having the federal government show kind of criteria and preferences for things that they think should be built. 1312 will prohibit state and cities and towns from tracking or setting goals around vehicle miles traveled. 1313 removes the bicycling element from general plan statute and also prohibits cities and towns over 50,000 from implementing transportation lane use policies that reduce system capacity for motor vehicles, which could be interpreted in a wide variety of ways. And then 1314 stipulates weight for transportation projects in ADOT's 5-year plan, and again prohibits ADOT from vehicle miles traveled targets. So folks have been mobilizing to request that these bills be vetoed, because it looks like, you know, at any time now, they just have one more step in the process and it can land on the governor's desk. You know, we expect Governor Hobbs to veto these bills, but we want advocates to prevent these bills from getting on her desk in the first place. So just getting those on folks' radar, you can go to azled.gov to type in these bill numbers and learn a little bit more. And then last but not least, we want to just bring some attention to our overall transportation network in Maricopa County. So there's the Prop 400E effort for our region of Maricopa County's transportation sales tax. So there's not too much time to be able to get into all the details of this. But Prop 400 extension would have been our ongoing regional half-cent sales tax to fund our transportation system for the next 25 years. Prop 300 was 20 years, Prop 400 is 20 years. Prop 400E was unanimously approved by our region's Transportation Policy Committee and Regional Council, which is comprised of mayors across the entire region of Maricopa County. It made it through the legislative process last year, but then was ultimately vetoed by Governor Doug Ducey. And so that meant that they had to go back to the drawing board to identify new bills that would enable this legislation to go to the voters. And so folks have been hard at work trying to ensure that this new version of the bill is as close as possible to the version that was approved by so many community members, all the mayors, by the majority of the the legislators to make it through the process last year. And so just getting these bill numbers down here, 1246, 1102, which are actually strike everything amendments, and have basically repurposed bills to try to reintroduce this half-cent sales tax continuation. And what we're advocating for is that there continues to be 41% of the funds to go towards transit, and that there continues to be the $1 billion program over 25 years, or iteration of that for the next 20 years, ends up being a 20-year bill that supports active transportation. So as you're reaching out to your legislators, I think reaching out and saying, hey, we support active transportation, we support transit, and that we want to see a version of the bill that looks as close as possible to that which was approved, supported by all the mayors in the region. And I'm seeing here, someone wants to see the Arizona bill slide 1697, 1312, 1313, 1314. Go to azled.gov and you can find more information about those bills. And then here are the Prop 400E bills that were repurposed to try to move something forward. So these are Republican legislators that are sponsoring these bills, and we continue. If folks really want to learn more, you can email me to learn more about the efforts of getting a good bill passed that will eventually go to the voters, because this 400 program will sunset here in the next year. With that, we are at time. So again, if there are things that you want to touch base about, you can email me at kennethfield@pinnacleprevention.org. We thank you all for being here, and we thank those that are watching the recording. Thank you for tuning in as well. We hope that this information about state and federal funding opportunities was helpful, and that you come again for any future AIM policy webinar opportunities that we have. Bye. And thank you, Ryan, for sharing those additional bills. Keep fighting the good fight.